everyone, welcome back. This is another Union Chapel live stream. My name is Jay Richardson. I'm the organ scholar at Union Chapel, and this series is part of our annual organ programme Mixture, which includes organ lessons, composition and performance masterclasses, school workshops, tours, organ recitals, and of course Organ Reframed, our annual experimental organ music festival. You can visit the website over at unionchapel.org.uk for more information on the programme. Today we're going to be talking about alternative forms of notation, and by that I mean notating music using methods other than staff notation. So during this time, the music director of the organ, Claire Singer, and I are trying to share as many elements as we can of the programme online. Last session we discussed notating for the organ with staff notation. Please do check that out if you missed it. It's on our education playlist on the YouTube channel. And we'd like to thank Arts Council England, the PRS Foundation, the Brereton Fund, and Spitfire Audio for all of their generous support of Mixture. And of course, thank you all for joining us for the second instalment. There are a series of links to the works that we're going to be talking about today in the description below. Feel free to either wait until the end of this video to go and look at them, or feel free to just pause me halfway through and look at them yourself. That's up to you. My aim today is to give you an overview of some of the most exciting developments in music notation in the last 100 years or so, but really as far back as I could find them up to the present day. It's by no means comprehensive, but it should give you an idea of what sorts of things people do and what's possible in this space. So before we dive into that, I thought I'd just recap briefly how the organ works in case you are thinking about writing for the organ, and we would heavily encourage you to do that. We are running a call for new organ scores, which I'll talk more about at the end. But I've got a top-down overview of the organ console at Union Chapel here. This is the bench that I'm hovering over right now. That's where the organist sits and they place their feet on the pedals. So this area is known as the pedal board. They play those notes with their feet. So it's effectively like having sort of 4 fingers. So you play with the toe and the heel of each foot. Above that, you've got the manuals. We have 3 on our instrument. That's quite usual for a medium-sized cathedral or church organ. Quite often you'll also see them with 2. Sometimes you'll also see them with 4 or 5, depending on where you are in the world. So that really depends. But those 3 different keyboards are known as the manuals. And then either side of the manuals, we have the stops. So those you pull out to activate new sounds, basically. You can see on the left over here, this stop is pulled out. Most of the rest of them are pushed in, so they're deactivated. But basically, each stop only applies to one specific manual. So this collection of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stops, for example, only applies to the swell. So if I pull out one of these 7 stops, and I play one of the other 2 manuals, it won't make any difference to the sound. The stops are specific to the manual that they're designed for. And when I pull out one of those stops, what I'm doing is activating one pipe per key on the manual that it's designed for. So in this case, I would guess that this manual has roughly 50 keys. So if I pull out one of these stops, I'm activating 50 pipes. And over the course of this whole rank of stops here, these 7 stops, there's 350 pipes that apply to those stops. So you can see it very quickly adds up into a huge instrument. So that's a very quick overview of how we play the organ. And yeah, as I said, please do write for it and go back and check out our entire webinar on writing for the organ. Was the last video we did. Right now though, we should talk about alternative forms of notation that don't use staff notation. And the first question here really is, why wouldn't you use staff music? Well, a number of reasons. Firstly, learning staff notation is hard. A lot more people can understand and work with graphic representations of sound. A lot more people can understand written language than can understand staff notation. So alternative forms of notation are much more accessible just from the starting point. And that also means you can perform these pieces really with whoever you want to. You can perform them with your school class, your neighbours, with a focus group, in group therapy, just with your friends, basically wherever and with whomever you like. That's an advantage that composers have really sort of grabbed with both hands, particularly in recent years. To take an example, Pauline Oliveros wrote a piece called Teach Yourself to Fly. There's a link to that down below, in which I'm quoting from the score here: "You should allow your vocal cords to vibrate in any mode which occurs naturally." End quote. So really, as you can see, anyone with vocal cords can perform that piece. And that means that with these forms of notation, you're not restricted to writing for people who already know how to play a musical instrument and to read this very technical and complicated design that we call staff notation. You're sort of liberated from that. And so these forms of notation are much better for performing with communities and diverse groups of people who don't necessarily have a quote-unquote conventional musical background. If you want to get your hands on more of those sorts of scores, I'll be mentioning a handful of anthologies later, but a really good source for particularly pieces by Pauline Oliveros, who's one of the sort of greats in this space, particularly with instruction scores, is the published collection of the magazine Source. That's by Larry Austin and Douglas Kahn. It's called Source Music of the Avant-Garde. So that's a collection of some wacky experimental scores. Another way in which you might want to use alternative notations is to get around the fact that staff notation can be very specific about some things while being very vague about others. So it's very specific about pitch, what pitch you're playing. It's very specific about how long the note should be, so duration, but it's very vague about the decay, the sort of rise and fall of the note, what it really sounds like in terms of timbre and overtones. Those sort of subtle matters of sound are not very well represented in staff notation. Additionally, a lot of staff notated scores look visually very similar, so you don't really get the chance to embody your ideas aesthetically and visually in your score. It's just they all sort of look the same, at least when compared to the amount of variety that you get in graphic scores, for example. So as an example of that, say I wanted to create a feeling of suspense in the middle of the note, or a note. I wanted it to sort of go almost as if I was throwing up a ball in the air and catching it. Here, in fact, is a rugby ball I prepared earlier. So imagine that I wanted to write a note that sort of goes up and down. So I wanted the dynamic content of the note to sort of be like that. That would be really hard to notate using staff notation. I would probably have to write something like pianissimo, very quick crescendo to fortissimo, and then subito pianissimo, and then sort of hover around there for a while, and then subito fortissimo, and then a quick diminuendo back to pianissimo, which is quite long and involved, and it's also quite hard to read. It takes people a few seconds to get their heads around what that actually translates to. However, if I wanted to draw it, notate it graphically, in other words, I could. All I would need to do is say at the start of the score, okay, thickness of the line represents the intensity or volume of the sound, and that's it really. That's sort of the content of the information that I want to give to my performer. It's as easy as that. So in some situations, graphic notation can actually be a lot more powerful than staff notation can. To take another example, what I think is one of the very best notated pieces for the organ is Ligeti Ease volumina That was written around 1962 when he was working in Stockholm. There's a link to that in the description. We've actually performed it on our organ, Henry, at Union Chapel. That was done a few years ago. And it works incredibly well. It's notated actually in quite a similar way to staff notation, in that you have these boxes that run horizontally across the page, and they represent different things that the organist is using, like the pedal board or each hand or whatever it might be throughout the piece. So the boxes work in very similar ways to staves, but they don't have the lines in the middle specifying the exact pitch. Instead, there are curves and there are textures and blobs that give you an idea of the pitch range. I won't go into more detail about that now, but the link that I've attached does have the score in it as well on the video, so do check that out. And of course you can buy the score from Editions Peters, I think. It's well worth it. It's a really great piece. So to give you an example of the power of using that notation, there's a point where Ligeti wants a sort of scramble of high-pitched sound up at the top of the organ. And if he were to try and notate what he wants there using conventional staff notation, it would look very, very complicated on the page. Instead, in Volumina, at one point, he just writes a thick black line at the top of one of his boxes. And that means that the organist knows that they should do something like that. So it's a really clear and a really simple way of notating something that would otherwise be quite complicated in staff notation. One of my very favourite pieces of instruction scores is by Lamont Young. It's from a collection called Compositions 1960. It's number 5. There's a link to that from the Museum of Modern Art. And that not only communicates something that would be complicated in staff notation, it actually communicates something that you wouldn't really think of if you sat down with a blank piece of staff paper. Part of that piece involves releasing a butterfly into the performance area, or multiple butterflies. If I sat down with staff notation, that's probably not the first thing I would think of doing, right? So to be asking somebody to write notes, to assign them durations, and to assign the whole lot to somebody playing an instrument is actually something you don't necessarily have to do. That's sometimes I think that's just a function of what notation system you're starting with. So bear in mind that the notation system that you intend to use can shape your thinking around actually what you're intending to write. That's an overview of why you might want to use alternative notations. I thought I would also talk about specific things that you can do with alternative scores that you can't do with staff notation. The one that's most important to me personally is that you can build in variables from outside of the world of the score and actually sort of bring them into the piece. So to show you what I mean by that, again, going back to Pauline Oliveros, she quite often encourages the participants in the performance to use their voice to reinforce the tones and the pitches that they hear in the space around them. Obviously that is going to change depending on what space you're in, and the sound it makes is going to change depending on the voices that you have in the room. So you're actually taking something external and building it into your piece. To give you another example, Henning Christiansen wrote a piece called Incompatibility, where there are 3 performers. The first one is reading out a text, any text, you can choose the text, and the other 2 performers are heckling the person who's reading the text. And every time somebody in the audience can't hear what the reader is saying, they must stand up and say, "Start from the beginning, please." And the piece is over when the reader has got all the way through their text. So it's basically a kind of staged sonic battle between the reader and the hecklers, and it's sort of umpired by the audience in a way. And the dynamics of that piece are gonna change depending on what audience you have, what sort of sound setup you have, if you're using a PA or if you're just doing it acoustic. So there are these things that are going to change each time you perform the piece. And those things are much easier to build in when you're using a more sort of open format, like a set of instructions or like a drawing, to communicate your musical ideas, instead of this very codified staff notation. Another thing that you can't generally do with staff notation, although this is sort of bending the idea a little bit, is to reformat your ideas into different shapes. So as an example, if you'd like everybody to perform from the same score, but with some people reading upside down, you can quite easily achieve that with a graphic score, because you should be able to read it in any orientation. You're just going to come out with very different results. A staff notated score obviously wouldn't make quite as much sense if you read it upside down. If you'd like to allow the performers to choose which parts of the piece to play and which to not play, one thing you could do is write out your music on a street map on the streets, and you could have the performers choose their own starting and ending points and their route, and then each time somebody plays the piece, they might take a different route to different destinations and start from different places. So you have written out a limited sort of variety of things that the performers could play, but you're not restricting them to play exactly the same thing in every performance. If, for example, you'd like to encourage them to, the performers to adapt the speed that they progress through your piece, adapt it to some external variable, like if it's really hot outside, you should play it faster, or if you've got loads of people in the audience, you should play it slower, or something like that. You could break up your piece into little tiny sections, and you could ask the performers to repeat those sections again and again and move on to the next one and that could be the thing that you vary. If you're in a large auditorium, you could move every 30 seconds. If you're in a small room, you could move every 5 seconds. So that kind of variability in how the piece sounds each time it's performed is a lot easier to achieve when you build in notation techniques that aren't necessarily standard to staff notation. Somebody once asked me if there are scoring and notating conventions that are specific to particular genres. There are several answers to that. I do think genres exist. I'm not going to call that into dispute right now. I do certainly think that scoring conventions exist. I wouldn't necessarily say that genres are very closely linked to scoring conventions. Composers tend to just use whatever is best for what they're trying to write, so the relationship between the two isn't always that fixed. I've seen cellular notation, which is what I was just talking about with breaking up the music into little, very small parts. I have seen that in a lot of places. I've seen it in Workers' Union, which is a piece by, I think, Louis Andriessen, who is a Dutch composer. I've seen it in Terry Riley's In C. There are links to both of those down below. I've seen curved staff notation, where you actually bend the shape of the staves everywhere, from Baud Cordier, who wrote a piece called Belle Bonne Sage. He was an early 15th century court musician in France. And I've seen the same technique in works by George Crumb, like Macrocosmos 1. So people use those techniques for all sorts of purposes, and it's not necessarily people from the same genres using the same techniques all the time. I have also been asked about combining different scoring techniques. And yes, that is definitely possible. In fact, I would really heavily encourage you to do that. Take any and every notational element that you feel might be helpful to you and just make it your own, use it in your own way. For example, you might notice that some composers write shapes for glissandi when you're sliding in between notes. Normally that's just a line, right? You slide from one note to the other. But occasionally those glissandi can take on different shapes. They can sort of squiggle a bit. And you'll see that in a piece by Yuji Takahashi called Sinubi, I think I'm pronouncing that right, where it starts as a glissando and then it just sort of takes a bit of a detour and the performer simply follows the shape as written out on the score. So that's a fairly sort of moderate, low-level alteration to the conventional notation. If you've come across Cathy Berberian, who's a really brilliant American performer, she wrote a piece called Stripsody. There's a video recording of somebody playing that, somebody singing that in the description, and a Spotify link as well. That's to a really brilliant album of her work. That's notated on 3 horizontal lines, so she's kept the sort of, again, she's kept the horizontal moving across the page idea, but there's only 3 of them, and nothing that's actually written on those lines bears any relation to what ordinary staff notated notes look like. They're mostly sort of cartoon drawings and cartoon style text and that sort of thing. To give a final example, John Cage's aria uses a sort of, again, it uses lines that go up and down to show the pitch, and it uses text to say what the singer should be singing, but it doesn't use actually any staves. So the possibilities for combining different notation techniques are endless, really, and that's why people are doing new things in this space all the time, just because there are so many fusions that can happen. I also thought at this point in the video we should take a step back and say, okay, there's this endless possibility, what on earth should I do with it? What are the most common things that people do? I would say, if you want a way to think about it, there's sort of 2 basic techniques that people use to notate music, really. There's graphic scoring, so using symbols or graphs in some way to represent sound, and instruction scores, so actually writing out what you want somebody to do. And then combinations of those 2. I actually think that staff notation can be thought of as a form of graphic scoring with some instructions in it. So again, it's a fusion of those 2. It's a very complicated system, and it takes a bit of time to get your head around, but essentially it still uses shapes and the positions and sizes of the shapes to represent sounds, and it uses some words to add some more information to that. Another thing that people very often do as an alteration of staff notation is using cells, which I've mentioned a couple of times now, those 2 or 3 bar snippets of music. They can be staff notated or otherwise, and you can rearrange them. You could put them on playing cards or street signs, or you could post them on Twitter, or anything else you want to do, really. You sort of break the music down into very small chunks that you can then play around with. That's quite a common thing that people do, and it can be really fun. It's also worth noting in terms of conventions that in music which is notated from left to right in time across the page, composers will very often add time markers in the form of bar lines. So they're not actual bar lines, they serve no sort of metric function because there isn't a meter, there's no time signature in these pieces, but they broadly indicate timing of the score in the same way that bar lines do. That can be quite a helpful way to let somebody know how fast or slow your piece should go, if indeed you do want to specify how fast or slow it should go, which you don't have to. But if you do want to specify that, then you can use time markers instead of bar lines. You could put a line sort of vertical line every 5 seconds and label it, or something like that. Some people have asked me if they can still use these techniques. Say you're a composer who's not particularly interested in working with scores that sound different every time they're performed. Are these techniques still appropriate to use where you want something to actually sound pretty similar, at least in terms of the notes that are played? And the answer is yes, you can still use these techniques. Definitely, there are still major advantages to them. You'll just need to be very precise in your scoring. So for example, if you're using graphic notation, that probably means including some sort of key or legend that explains what each color means, or what the thickness of a line means, or what some sort of symbol means. It's actually not unusual for graphic scores to contain 2 or 3 pages of explanation at the start of the piece. So yeah, don't be put off by the need to provide that. If you're writing a text score, you might want to be more or less specific about the content of the piece, depending on what you're actually writing. But you can, of course, use words to be very specific about what you want. One of my favorite pieces is by Al Hansen. It's called Car Bibi. At least that's how I pronounce it. It involves a number of cars, and the score is a list of instructions for the operator, driver. They're not actually going to drive the cars anywhere, but the operator of each car. And they're things like toot horn 5 times, or open and close glove compartment, or raise and lower the windows, etc. So those are actually quite specific instructions, and you have to follow them in the order that they're presented. If Al Hansen had wanted to be even more specific about that, he could have said, he could have put time markers in to specify how fast the piece should go. So yes, absolutely. If you want to write music that's very specific and sounds the same each time, you can do that. You just have to think about what things could be changing between performances, and then sort of write out that possibility. You may at some points have an idea for a notation technique that nobody has tried yet, and you can't find it anywhere. You can't find any precedent for it. That's great. Go for it. Use it. As long as you can explain it to other people who might want to perform it. As long as it's fairly quick to learn, and most importantly, as long as you can show that it's the clearest way of notating the thing that you actually want to write. Actually, most performers will be really grateful to you for coming up with something that makes their lives easier. And there's of course the fact that other composers could benefit from your ideas as well. So yes, absolutely, if you think of something new, then please shout about it and let everybody know, and write a piece that uses that technique. The next question is how to know that the notation technique you say you've thought of this pioneering new technique, how do you know it's going to work? Well, the best approach to that is actually just to ask somebody to perform it with you. You can perform it yourself. The danger with that is that you already know how it works. So if there are things that are not clear in the score, you're probably not going to spot them because you wrote it. But if you can find people to perform it with you, they might spot things. If it's not an entirely new technique, try and find other pieces that are notated in a similar way, and look at how they have been written out. And in particular, try and find recordings, preferably video recordings of people doing those performances, so you can see how they have performed the scores. It's quite often interesting to see, some scores, particularly instruction-based scores, are deliberately very vague. There's a piece by Lamont Young where the entire text of the score is most of them were very old grasshoppers, and people interpret that in a myriad of different ways. So if you can find something that's been notated in a similar way to the way you want to write, go and see how musicians have interpreted that notation to figure out if you're actually likely to get the result that you want out of using that technique. So we're nearly at the end. I just wanted to touch on a couple more things. At least when I was starting to write music, I felt that all of this alternative stuff was a little bit sort of strange, and that staff notation worked just fine, and there was no real need for me to learn any other method because I was comfortable in staff notation and it worked for me. So why should you learn alternatives? Well, in my case, once I had learned those alternative methods, they very quickly came in handy. I have written organ pieces with no bar lines because I actually want pauses to be taken in different places by each organist. And if I hadn't studied scores that had no bar lines and figured out how all that works, I probably would have just written an instruction at the start that says, take pauses in strange places wherever you want to. And that's not nearly as clear as actually spacing out the notes in different ways, or I produced several different copies of that score and gave them to different people. So even if you're planning to just very slightly adapt your staff notation, that still can make your scores much easier to read, and it may well still be worthwhile. There's also the fact that if you can build in references to other works in the piece that you're writing, Satie very famously wrote things on his scores that didn't necessarily relate directly. They weren't performance instructions in the sense of actually literally telling you to do something, but they are performance instructions in the sense that they give the sort of aesthetic of the piece. They're quotations from literature. They were instructions to go and look at particular pieces of art that had inspired the person who was writing the piece. Excuse me. I've even come across pieces that ask the performer to learn how to skateboard before attempting to play the piece, because the composer wants to be able to talk about those sort of embodied, those sort of bodily feelings of riding a skateboard, and so the performer needs to know what riding a skateboard feels like. So even if you're thinking of just sticking with staff notation, it's always instructive and always useful to just go and see what other people have done. Expand your horizons of what's possible. You don't have to actually use those techniques yourself, but it's always sort of nice to know. That brings us on to the question of where to find all of this stuff. In Western European music, odd examples have existed since the medieval period, really. It became mainstream in the Western European tradition during, I would say, the heyday of post-war modernism, so in the between the 50s and the 70s, maybe the early 80s, particularly in America. And that's for a number of reasons. Some of those reasons are the advantages we've just talked about. People wanted to make their music more accessible, more flexible, more powerful in some ways. There was also a tendency amongst modernist composers at the time, particularly people using serial techniques like Pierre Boulez, Luciano Berio, and their contemporaries, to write very specific instructions within their conventional staff notation with respect to things like dynamics, rhythms, articulations, that sort of thing. And those scores very quickly became very full of information, sometimes quite difficult to read, certainly very difficult to sight read. And that meant that they were usually just performed in situations where the performers had had lots of preparation time, but it wasn't that easy for someone to pick them up and just play them. So the scoring methods we've discussed were partly a response to say, no, actually we want to write pieces that are performable by the community, within the community, not just by very highly trained people. So yeah, that's sort of where I would say the modern tradition of it springs from, is people like John Cage, Pauline Oliveros, Cornelius Cardew. Those are that's the first big cluster of people you'll find working in this space in the late 60s up until the present day, really. As for finding those scores and finding examples of what people have done, it is quite tricky. A lot of these scores weren't very widely published. Some of the notation methods, although modern composers do use a lot of alternative notations, still I would say staff notation dominates in terms of composition worldwide. So I think the best way to find examples is to look for anthologies that are specifically devoted to alternative notation methods. And these are going to come in handy throughout our next couple of workshops as well, when we're taking a more of a deep dive into graphic notation and instruction scores. There's a compilation of lectures and prose works by John Cage called Silence. That's a really good place to start. It's mainly essays about sort of the philosophy of music in general. They're really interesting. A lot of them are really fun. Some of them are quite funny. It's also a good place to find text-based scores. Cage also, with Alison Knowles, the two of them compiled a book called Notations. That was in 1969. It's a collection of excerpts from the manuscript copies of certain scores. A lot of them use alternative notation methods, but some of them don't. Some of them are just really visually pleasing or interesting examples of ordinary staff notation. A contemporary update to that is Notations 21, which is a project by Teresa Zauer, I think I'm saying that right, of graphic scores. And those are by over 100 different composers, I think, from every continent on the planet. It sounds like a wonderful book. I've been unable to get hold of a copy so far. I think they're quite rare. I obviously can't go out to a library to see if libraries have got them because all the libraries are shut, but I suspect that there are copies in libraries, particularly music-focused libraries. So see if you can find it in a library near you, and do go online and read about the project. It's been expanded into several exhibitions worldwide, so those are really, really cool pieces, and a lot of them are by composers, who are still alive and working today. So that's really great. The Experimental Music Catalogue is a website mainly about British composers, and they have some really cool free downloads to pieces that British composers have written, and they also publish an anthology which you can buy on their website. I think it's about £8.50 to download the PDF. Really though, with all of those anthologies, do find composers' websites as well. Sometimes they'll have example scores, and they'll usually be more than happy for people to reach out to them on social media and ask about their compositions. But with all of that behind us, if you're trying to get to know a new notation method, the best way is just to perform the pieces that have been written using that method, whether they're yours or whether they're somebody else's, and not just to read the scores and think about what the performance might involve, but to actually sort of do it yourself. That's really a rich experience, particularly if you've not come across that notation method for a while. It can give you insights into how that method works that you wouldn't get from just reading it. And of course, the last thing I'll say is that every composer treats scoring very differently. So pay attention to a wide variety of artists, not just people who worked in a particular time or place, although if you want to really get into Fluxus, then you can do that. There's lots of material on that, but also pay attention to composers working today in a wide variety of different places from a wide variety of backgrounds, because everybody has something to bring to the table. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do tune in next time. That's Wednesday the 29th of April at 3 p.m. We're going to be talking about graphic scoring next week. So lots of very visually dynamic scores to delve into next week. Just a quick note, we had some technical issues with YouTube last week, so this video may well be taken down for the next few hours or the next couple of days, but we will get it back up as soon as possible if we do have to take it down. After session 4, in a few weeks' time, we're going to be opening up a call for 5-minute compositions using some of the techniques that we've covered in the series. So a selection of 10 of those will be performed by our organ students at the chapel when we reopen. So please stay tuned throughout for more information on that. Again, if you missed our first webinar, you can watch that on our YouTube channel. Go back and find the video of that. Thanks again from Claire and myself, and from all of Union Chapel for watching today. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And of course, please stay safe. Thank you very much.